All right, our first speaker is Avalon Fenster. She is a media activist and our next gen board advisor. She has some very strong things to say about media and teens' roles in creating it and taking more agency in it. So with that, take it away, Avalon.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning. I'm so excited to be here. I had a lovely conversation getting to know some of our students that are here today, and I'm just feeling really optimistic about not only this day and this event, but also the future after hearing more from my peers. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my presentation with you all. Let's see, present. Perfect. I think you all can see that. So today I'm going to be speaking. I want to preface this by saying I'm speaking from my own personal experiences, not only as a young person, a 20-year-old, a full-time student, a member of Gen Z, but also as someone who has extensive experience in policy advocacy and has spent the last few years kind of doing a deep dive into tech policy. So the center of really what I wanted to talk about today and open our day up with is actually a little bit maybe audacious, but thinking about how we change, how we think about innovating, and how we think about doing this together across generations and across our divisions. So I wanted to start off first with an introduction, a little bit about me. So I'm Avalon. Who am I? First, I'm a 20-year-old full-time college student. I'm a junior at Barnard College of Columbia University. I'm double majoring in political science and human rights, and I'm double minoring in philosophy and Barnard's Science, Ethics, and Policy program. And so the real core focus of my studies is how politics and global human rights are going to be impacted both in the short and long term by technological innovation, specifically when it comes to data privacy, artificial intelligence, and sustainability. I also am an experienced policy advocate and activist with experience across sectors. I've worked in both houses of Congress. I've worked in the grassroots level with multiple national nonprofits, as well as on the national level. And I've spent the last 2 years interning at companies like Intel and Verizon in the Global Government Affairs Unit, doing kind of extensive policy research work on what are the up and coming pieces of legislation, conversations that have to do with how we're moving forward with ethics and technology, ranging from issues like broadband and internet to software and surveillance. I'm also a creator of social media content viewed by millions of people between the ages of 10 to 22 on Instagram, TikTok, Substack, Discord, and some various other platforms. You can find me on everything at Internship Girl, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that kind of at the tail end of my presentation. But most importantly, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, and I'm a first-generation American woman. So I wanted to open up by showing these two pictures. The one to the left is of my father and his father, and the one to the right is of my mother and her father. And this is really important to me because, like many of you, I'm sure, my family history has deeply informed how I see the world and how I perceive my purpose. And on the left, the photo of my father and his father, it's very special to me because it's one of the few photos that I have of my grandfather who was a Holocaust survivor. When he was 16 years old, he was orphaned. He was taken to a concentration camp and he survived because the doctor who was taking him in, the Nazi doctor, was a childhood friend of his who he played soccer with growing up. And so at 16 years old, he lost his entire family. He spent a few years in Russian prisons. He was hiding in farmhouses, and he lived for the rest of his life until the day he died under a fake identity that was given him by a Polish soldier that saw him hiding in a furrier shop when he was just a child. And the photo on the right is of my mother and her father. And my maternal grandfather is a Soviet refusenik. So he grew up in Ukraine, what was formerly at that time really all of Russia. It was just the USSR. And he was persecuted on the basis of his Jewish identity. My grandfather was visibly Jewish. He was denied access to numerous colleges. He was denied access to jobs. And he was tracked on the streets by the KGB. And so he attempted to leave the Soviet Union, but he wasn't allowed out on the basis of his Jewish identity. It was only through an amendment to the 1974 Trade Act that he was allowed to leave. The United States did some kind of exchange through policy when it came to trade in allowing Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union in light of the persecution they faced. And I always talk about my family story when I talk about any advocacy work that I'm passionate about, because it was through the experiences of my family that I grew up having a lot of conversations about the obligations that we all have to be engaged citizens and to pay attention to the weight that political decisions hold, and to pay attention to the changing world around us and not think things like, well, that could never happen. It can never happen to me. It can never happen to my kids. It can never happen to my family, because it can and it will. My family history is proof of that. And so it was through this understanding that I grew up with that I became really passionate about advocacy work. I started in advocacy when I was very young. My mother took me to a lot of the meetings that she went to, whether they were protests or organizing meetings. Um, but it wasn't until 2018, after the Parkland shooting, where 17 students and teachers were killed in their high school, where I was really motivated to action on the national level. And so I started off first working on a local level. I organized a rally that was attended by 3,000 people, largely students from my community, to speak loud and clear to our political leaders that we demanded change when it came to gun violence prevention in all of our communities. And it was over the course of a few months that I went from being a local organizer to then working on the New York State level, to then working on national field organizing and national social media and communications work with the organization March for Our Lives that was started out of the Parkland shooting. And what I wanted to share with you all today is there was a lot of attention and visibility on the national movement. The national movement got a lot of money, funding, resources. There were celebrity voices that were backing it. I'm sure a few of you who might have been paying attention at that time saw kind of the tidal wave of support that came out for these students who experienced this mass shooting and demanded change. But not only was I involved in the national level, but I started out as a local organizer. And what I really want you guys all to know is that while young people have this fierce energy, passion, momentum, ideas, opinions, we don't have the structural support that we needed at that time to make change. And it was only because of the collaboration that was extended to me by my local political officials. For example, my state senator, I reached out to him, and he used to come to local March for Our Lives meetings in Long Island to talk to us about the work he was doing in Albany, in our state capital. The mentors in our community from either the political parties or the partnering organizations, or there were religious leaders that came and spoke to our group of youth. It was only through their collaboration that we were able to make change. And in New York State, I vividly remember it. It was, I think, the next year, I was having a meeting with my peers in Long Island, recapping what we had accomplished over the past year. And our state senator, Senator Jim Gorin, came into the room, and he told us that it was partially a huge part of our efforts contributed to the passage of a new gun violence prevention law in New York State, and that he couldn't have done it without us. And while it was such an admirable sentiment that he couldn't have done it without us, and I'll agree that that's true, what I really have been reflecting on since that time was we had the ideas, again, we had the passion, but we didn't have was the money. We didn't have the knowledge of the networks that exist in our local and national community. We didn't understand the depth of the political institution. And without this knowledge, without the support, and without these resources, we wouldn't have been able to make change on a local level and forget about a national level. And so, as you can see, I have this little diagram here that shows the big guys, these big bureaucratic, historic institutions, and then there's young people. And so I think this diagram here really shows the point that I'm trying to hammer home today, which is on the left of this Venn diagram, this represents young people and the rising generation, my generation. We have the energy, we have our hand really on the pulse of what's current and what's rising. And we also have a sort of innate understanding of media and social media. Even those of us that are not very active, we understand the influence that these tools have. And so while we have the passion, we have the understanding of what's current, we kind of can predict what's going to happen in the future. We're very in the center of pop culture. What we don't have is the wisdom, the funds, and the breadth of understanding of networks and institutions and resources and industries that older generations and current industry leaders have. And so, while I deeply admire sort of this revolutionary rhetoric of young people as the change, and while I don't admire the rhetoric that comes from the older generations know everything and young people need to stay in their place and just go to school, what I really believe we're missing is this intergenerational collaboration. And I truly believe that this is where change happens. And this is really what we're missing. And when it comes to the issue specifically of media and technology, we have a myriad of problems that our generation is facing. And like I said, I've spent the last 2 years, I worked at Intel the summer after my freshman year of college on the global government affairs team, where I did mostly human rights research related to legislative proposals on technology related to surveillance, artificial intelligence, and data privacy. And so we have a few problems when it comes to media and when it comes to technology. We have the misaligned incentives, where I believe that we've really lost sight of what matters most in a world where intentions really mirror impact. So big social media platforms are prioritizing quick clicks and addiction to the platform over public good. We have threats to our civil rights and our civil liberties and our human rights. We face a lot of concerns when it comes to data privacy in the midst of rapidly scaling technological development. I'm doing some research now on how COVID tracing apps that weren't associated with the state and were associated with the state have different privacy concerns, and kind of how those COVID as a case study is going to be mirrored as we go on, as technology continues to develop and human beings increasingly opt into technologies. We're facing a public health crisis. Research is increasingly showing that social media is having a very negative effect on my generation's emotional, mental, and physical health. We have politics that's focused on power instead of solutions. It's often controlled by polarizing narratives, money, and increasingly relies on prejudice. And last, but I think certainly not least, my generation isn't given many options. And one of the things that I really talk about, especially when we're having these cross-generational conversations, is there's this sort of idea and rhetoric that my generation, if we don't like social media, we should just get off of it. We should just delete it. We should just opt out. And the reality is, of course, we can do that. Right now, I can delete Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and every other platform on my phone, off of my phone. But if we do that as a generation, we're opting out of cultural conversation and we're opting out of our cultural currency and connection. And so my generation can't really afford to just opt out of social media when we don't like it. And so we actually do need solutions. And those solutions won't come if we are separated into two houses. I would rather that our collaboration and the future and our progress and how we're coming up with ideas and we're implementing those ideas look more like the Venn diagram I just showed you than two houses, than a house divided. Because a house divided, as Abraham Lincoln famously said, cannot stand. And so I specifically really wanted to bring this up because today in this room, we have from people from the ages of 15 years old to people who I won't go into your ages, but we have people across the age spectrum here. And you all come from a variety of expertises and leadership and understandings. And some of you are profound leaders in your space. And of course, I can't mirror that at just 20 years old. I'm still in college. I've had my experience, but I haven't had the experience that you've had. But what I really believe is the future is this mutual support. And what I'll say here is that my generation does not need cynicism. We need support on the issues that will make our world more complicated to inherit than yours. What I hear a lot when it comes to media is this sort of rhetoric around, well, those kids, they're just obsessed with their phones. They're just obsessed with their computers. They're addicted to social media. They don't know what real life is like. They don't have any real hobbies. You can't call yourself an influencer. What does that even mean? These are just a few of the things that I've heard in conversations with friends, family, teachers, even people that I've worked with. And while I understand that sentiment, and while I deeply understand the frustration that many have over social media, what we don't need is the criticism and the cynicism. What we need is support. What we need is your expertise. We need your knowledge, and we need your resources and your networks. And while every single generation has had a complicated world to inherit, it is the truth that our generation is inheriting a world that is more affected than ever by climate change, that's dealing with now the impacts of the internet and media that we haven't seen before, that future generations did not inherit. We're dealing with increased levels of crisis and war and poverty, and our generation has some of the highest levels of anxiety and depression among any generation. And so we are inheriting a very complicated world, and a world that is largely complicated by media, by news, by social media, by technology, by uncertainties about how all of these things are going to impact us. So we don't need the criticism. We don't need the cynicism. That's not productive. What we need is collaboration. And so here I've kind of drawn out, and this is a draft, and I want you guys to consider this, what a new process could look like of innovation when it comes to media, but also when it comes to business, when it comes to creativity, when it comes to politics, a new process of innovation and co-creation. And so for me, this process ideally is intergenerational. And so it looks like having public good at the very front of what we do. Social impact, cultural impact, equity and inclusion, all of those good things, but actually realigning the incentives that we have in innovating beyond just profit, beyond addiction to algorithms, but actually to public good. What would it look like if what we worked on actually increased public education, awareness, and engagement? And how would that impact the next generation? And how would that impact us and set us up for a world that we were able to inherit successfully for not only ourselves, but our children and our children's children? It looks like authentic bridge building and cultural exchange. So instead of remaining in these silos where we just don't understand each other, we don't understand each other's perspectives, and we don't like them, we actually work to have constant, tough conversations about the cultures of our generations and how that impacts our perspectives and the expertise we have, and bridge building across cultures rather than increasingly polarizing ourselves into different labels and check boxes, but instead actually taking those identifiers and using them as opportunities for connection, using history as the compass. So, thinking about our future and thinking about moving fast, quickly to a new world should not mean forgetting history. And I can especially say this as someone who is not only the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, but also a religious Jewish refugee. We live in a world that forgets the history and forgets the past. And so it's important to keep that at the front and center of what we're doing. How have decisions that have mirrored ours panned out in the past? Whether the past is 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 25, 50 years ago. And for example, I wouldn't know beyond just studying something how that impacted people 30 years ago. But if you've been in your industry and you've been a leader and you're an expert and you know because you were at the forefront of your industry at that time, you can tell me what you know and I can learn from that and I can be effectively part of the solution. Embracing interdisciplinary thinking and supporting multi-hyphenates. So really thinking about how we get out of just our areas of what we're good at and encourage to think beyond the boundaries. So I can say this for sure. After working for the last 2 years in technology policy, we can't afford technologists and data engineers that don't consider ethics and don't consider the human impact of their decisions and don't look at how our world is increasingly shaped by empirical and technological innovation. The same way that human rights activists and political leaders can't ignore the way that, for example, lack of equal access to internet is impacting outcomes across demographics. And so we really need to embrace interdisciplinary thinking and support people who have multiple identities, people who aren't just in one field, but also have, like my generation, increasingly so, a multitude of understandings and experiences. So while I'm in the process of applying to law school, I'm experienced at policy, I'm experienced in advocacy, I'm also a social media content creator. And so my experience as a content creator has deeply informed how I understand even political public opinion, how I understand public engagement, how I understand the world, how I understand how people interact with one another and how power works. And so embracing that multi-hyphenate and interdisciplinary thinking, I think, is key to a new intergenerational innovation process. Also, setting a futuristic vision and not just benchmarks for progress and goals. Really, what do I want my business, my industry, my project to look like and impact the world 50 years from now, and not just thinking about making the bottom line a year from now. And I think that this is something that is missing, but we're seeing increasingly industries moving forward this kind of more futuristic model of thinking, especially when it comes to how we're going to address the changing scale and environment when it comes to technology. And so I think all of these things combined, we can not only educate each other, but we can empower each other and we can engage one another. And so, as I wrap up, I want to tell you that the rising generation is eager to lead. We're not just eager to shout our opinions into the void. And please take it from the 200,000 10 to 22-year-olds that follow me across platforms. My platform primarily focuses on early career education for young people, providing resources, information, and opportunities. And what I can tell you is that my generation is eager to lead. We're eager to be experts. We're eager to succeed, but we cannot do that without the expertise and knowledge of those who have come before us. And so I want to leave you with this question of what world can we create together? And how can our world look different? Not only when we're, for example, the leaders and the people in power currently are listening to young people, but when they're actually working collaboratively with young people. And what can young people learn from industry leaders, aside from just knowing that their opinions are important and that we should be vocal about what we care about? What tangible skills can we actually gain that can make us the people that transform our world and steer this ship back on course? And so I know a lot of the things that I'm saying might sound big, but I encourage you, as you move into the small groups later today, you actually start thinking tangibly about how you in particular can start building bridges, if you haven't already, with the younger generation, beyond just as a mentor or beyond just as a listener, but as an active co-collaborator. And so with that, I'll close. There's lots more that I could touch on from my experiences in advocacy, as a content creator, as a young person, as an emerging leader. But what I've really realized is that ultimately, we can't move forward without this interdisciplinary hearing and collaboration. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to take any questions privately in the chat. And I'm also going to drop my LinkedIn here if anyone wants to connect with me and learn more, or just has any ideas. Would love to connect.